On the 6th of February 2014, 5 Finns cut through the ice of a Norwegian river with a chainsaw and went under a mountain. All of them were supposed to come out on the other side. 3 came out. It happened more than 100 meters down, in a restriction where 2 men in full gear cannot fit side by side. There was no way back from there. Afterwards, the Norwegian authorities banned any attempt to bring the 2 men out. And a month and a half later, their friends came back and did it themselves, without permission. But it all starts much earlier, and much more quietly. In northern Norway, in the county of Nordland, not far from the town of Mo i Rana, lies a narrow valley called Plurdalen. The Plura River runs along its floor. At one point, it simply disappears. It goes under the mountain and keeps flowing inside the rock. The rock here is limestone and marble. Water dissolved it over thousands of years and ate a system of galleries into the massif. It is called Plura. The known part is about 3 kilometers long and at least 135 meters deep. Almost the whole cave is flooded. A section like that is called a sump, a passage filled right up to the ceiling where you cannot surface and you cannot take the mouthpiece out. The only way through it is on scuba. And any trouble has to be sorted out exactly where it happens. There is nowhere to go. The first dive was made in 1980 by 2 Norwegians, Svein Grundstrøm and Bjørn Fagertun. From 1987, the system was worked through by divers of the Norwegian Fire Service, year after year, section after section. By 1997, they had surveyed and mapped almost 3 kilometers of passage. The water in Plura is cold all year round. Measurements give anywhere from 2 to 7 degrees Celsius, depending on the season. This is not the kind of cold you get used to. In 2-degree water, a man in a dry suit bleeds heat for hours, and the longer he stays underground, the harder it presses on his head. Depth plus cold puts Plura among the toughest flooded caves in northern Europe. Nobody comes here to learn. The people who come are the ones who have already done everything closer to home. In 2006, a Norwegian diver was lost in the system. British cave divers brought him out at the end of August that same year. By the early 2010s, Plura was drawing a small circle of technical divers from all over Europe. The 5 men who would arrive in this valley in the winter of 2014 did not meet in Norway. What brought them together was Ojamo, a flooded mine west of Helsinki. Finnish divers turned that old limestone working into their training ground. They have spent years there rehearsing what they later do in real caves. The Finnish cave diving community is small, a few dozen people who know each other by sight and dive in the same handful of places. Ojamo was one of them. The most experienced of the 5 was Patrick Grönqvist, 42, a firefighter from Porvoo. By 2014, he had around 17 years of diving behind him. Kai Kankanen, 46, an electrical fitter from Vantaa. Jari Huotarinen, 40, a production manager from Valkeakoski. Vesa Rantanen, an electrical design engineer from Hämeenlinna. Sources give his age as either 30 or 33. Jari Usimäki, 34, a mechanical engineer from Espoo. All 5 held the CCR full cave qualification. That is the ticket for cave diving on a closed-circuit rebreather, a unit that does not dump your exhaled breath into the water, but pushes it through a carbon dioxide scrubber and hands it back to you with oxygen added. The upside is obvious. With a rebreather, you go underground for many hours, and you are not dragging a mountain of cylinders behind you. There is a price, too. The unit needs watching without a break, and under heavy work at depth, the scrubber can fall behind. Then carbon dioxide starts building up in the loop. None of the 5 was a professional diver by trade. A firefighter, an electrician, 2 engineers, a production man. Caves were the thing they took their holidays for and saved their money for. In the autumn of 2013, some of them did something in that system that nobody had managed before. The cave system has a second known entrance. It is called Steinuglfløget, and it lies on the other side of the massif, a dry cave, a crack in a collapsed hillside. For decades, nobody knew whether Plura and Steinuglfløget joined up underground, or whether they were 2 separate holes in the same rock. In September 2013, a Finnish team found that connection and swam it. The first through dive was made by Kai Kankanen, Patrick Grönqvist, and Sami Pakarinen. For the community, it was an event. The find explained how the 2 halves of the system link up inside the limestone. In the cave diving world, a route like that is called a traverse. The idea is to go in on one side of the mountain, pass right underneath it, and come out on the other. You almost never turn back on one. Once you are past the halfway point, going back is longer and costs more gas than pressing on. The underwater part of the Plura traverse runs roughly 2,000 meters. It does not go horizontally. From the entrance pool, the gallery drops away, down to about 130 meters, and then climbs again. The exit at Steinugelflaget sits about 100 meters below ground level. When you surface, you are still not outside. Grönqvist would later call the deep part of Plura the deepest sump in the world ever passed all the way through. The claim is arguable, but it shows very well what that connection meant to them, an achievement people talk about afterwards in a small circle. After September 2013, the traverse was no longer a mystery. Now, it was pulling them back, and in the other direction this time. Choosing February only looks strange from the outside. In summer, the Plura carries meltwater and sediment. All of it gets sucked into the system, lifts the silt off the floor, and turns the galleries into a white haze where your light shows you an outstretched arm and not much more. In winter, the river settles, the sediment drops out, and the water inside gets noticeably clearer. The best visibility of the year in Plura falls in the cold months. February in Plurdalen also means an empty valley. No outsiders, nobody working behind your back, and you can lay your gear out in peace. There was a third reason too, and it had nothing to do with the water. The project was always bigger than a single dive. The Finnish filmmakers Jana Suhonen and Antti Apunen were putting together a film about an attempt at a distance record in cave diving, and a crew had come out to the valley. Some of the dives were to be filmed on helmet cameras, the same cameras whose footage would later become the backbone of a completely different story. On the 6th of February 2014, 5 men set out to swim the traverse for only the second time in history, and for the first time in this direction, in through the Plura River, out through the dry cave at Steinugelflaget. Planned dive time was around 5 hours. About 2 of those hours go not to the journey, but to decompression. After a depth of roughly 130 meters, you cannot simply swim up. You have to hang for hours on intermediate stops while the gas is dissolved in your blood, work their way slowly out. To shorten the journey, they took diver propulsion vehicles, scooters that tow a diver along. They save your strength and your breathing gas. They are also one more object that can jam or fail. They decided to split the group in 2 and stagger them in time. The reason was technical. The first divers stir the water up, and the second team needs time for it to settle again. The morning of the 6th of February starts with a chainsaw. The entrance pool on the Plura River is covered by about half a meter of ice. They cut it, lift out a triangular slab, and drag it onto the snow. What is left is an open hole. It is the only way into the system, and if anything goes wrong, it is the only way back. The water temperature that day is about 2 degrees Celsius. At around 12:30, Patrick Grönqvist and Jari Huotarinen go into the water, the first pair. Roughly 2 hours later, at about 2:15, Kai Kankinen, Vesa Rantanen, and Jari Usimaki follow them in. That gap has a flip side. There is no communication underwater in a cave, no radio, no telephone. The 2 groups underground are cut off from each other and from everyone else. The first pair follow the guideline, a thin cord strung along the route that shows you the way when the water goes murky. Lose it in a flooded cave, and you have lost your sense of direction completely. The gallery drops away. Grönqvist and Huotarinen reach a maximum depth of about 132 meters. At that depth, everything works differently. The gas thickens. Every breath takes effort. You cannot rush. An extra movement costs you breath, and down there, breath costs time. All that separates the body from 2-degree water is a thin layer of air under a dry suit. Tearing that suit at depth is not a matter of discomfort. The nearest exit is hours away. About an hour after entering, Grönqvist looks back. There is nobody behind him. Grönqvist turns around and goes back along the guideline. He finds his partner at a depth of around 111 meters. Jari Huotarinen is stuck in a restriction, the name for a spot where the passage narrows so much that a diver only just squeezes through, turning sideways. By one account, the scooter jammed under a rock. Huotarinen himself became tangled in a line, running from his own equipment. In cave diving, this is an ordinary situation. and at the same time, one of the most dangerous. You cannot fight your way out by force in a tight spot. The harder a man works, the faster his breathing gets away from him. And you cannot help him by wedging yourself in behind him either. The second man ends up pinned as well, burning his own gas at exactly the same rate. What happened next is known from Grönqvist's account. Hutarinen demanded open circuit, emergency gas straight from a plain cylinder, bypassing the rebreather. Open circuit vents your exhaled breath into the water, so it guarantees a clean mix, but the supply is finite, and at depth it runs down very fast. Grönqvist passed him the mouthpiece from his own reserve. Hutarinen took about 10 breaths and went back onto his own unit. Analyses of the accident link behavior like that to hypercapnia, a buildup of carbon dioxide in the breathing loop. It brings on air hunger, it muddles your thinking, and panic rolls in. And the worst part is that a man usually has no idea what is happening to him and carries on making decisions as though everything were fine. On another attempt to switch mouthpieces, Hutarinen took in water. Grönqvist could not free him and get him out. At that depth, there is neither the time nor the strength for drawn-out attempts. Within a few minutes, it was clear that there was nothing more that could be done. From that point on, Grönqvist was alone in the deep part of the system, and on his wrist ran a number that was turning into a problem all by itself. A dive computer keeps recalculating how long you will have to spend on stops during the ascent. Grönqvist's plan had come out at 120 minutes. While he was fighting for his partner and hanging at maximum depth longer than planned, the number climbed past 400. 7 hours instead of 2. Skipping those stops on a profile like that meant all but guaranteed decompression sickness, gas bubbles in tissue and blood, damage to the joints, and in the worst case, to the spinal cord. After that came the arithmetic. His breathing gas had been planned for 5 hours. Everything on top of that had to be scraped together from what was left and spread across the stops. The hole in the ice was further away than Steinugelflaget. Grönqvist went forward, alone, knowing his partner was behind him in the restriction, and that nothing could change that. He did not know what was happening to the other 3. He did not know whether they had even reached the deep section, and he had no way to tell anyone on the surface. Decompression in a cave is not the same as decompression at sea. What is over your head is not the surface, but 100 meters of rock. What followed was hours of hanging almost motionless in 2-degree water. At that stage, sudden movements are more dangerous than the cold. You cannot warm up. You cannot leave. All you can do is watch the numbers and wait for them to run down to 0. He would later describe that wait in a single line. He was certain that none of the others had come out alive, and 2 hours behind him, the second team was on its way. Kai Kankinen, Vesa Rantanen, and Jari Uusimäki were descending the same sloping gallery into the deep part of the system, on plan to the minute, knowing nothing about what lay ahead. Their teammate had died in the restriction. The passage was blocked. Sources give the depth of that restriction differently. Some say 110 meters, others 125. The data is contradictory. Rantanen was in front. He tried to push on, got stuck in the narrow gap, and squeezed past with enormous difficulty. It cost him more than 15 minutes at maximum depth. Neither those minutes nor the gas to cover them existed anywhere in the plan. Once he was on the far side of the restriction, Rantanen was in Grönqvist's position. Back meant the same spot all over again. Forward meant almost 2 kilometers to the exit. He went for the exit. Jari Uusimäki died in that same place shortly afterwards. The official finding of the Norwegian investigation is that he panicked when he was faced with what he saw in the restriction. There is another reading, out of the discussions inside the diving community, that Uusimäki switched to open circuit and ran out of gas. No witnesses were left at that depth, so there is no way to choose between the 2 versions. Kankinen weighed up the situation. There was no help left to give, and pushing into the restriction with the risk of getting tangled himself would only have added a third name to the 2. He turned around and started back, alone, through everything he had already swum, towards the hole in the ice they had gone under a few hours earlier. By the evening of the 6th of February, 3 men were still alive under the mountain. Each of them got out his own way, 2 pushing forward through the mountain, the third heading back to the hole in the ice. Patrick Grönqvist spent around 8.5 hours underwater. He surfaced in the dry cave of Steinugelflaget at about 9:15 in the evening. Vesa Rantanen made it to the same place, only it cost him more. He was short on gas, and he cut his decompression roughly 80 minutes short. The logic was simple. Running out of breathing gas at depth is more dangerous than surfacing under decompressed. Both of them were in an air-filled chamber now, still inside the mountain, about 100 meters below the surface. They stayed put there for about an hour, not to rest. After decompression like that, a sudden physical load can be fatal for a man with too much gas still in his tissues. Then came the climb. Up through the dry cave, rock by rock, in soaking gear, after 8 hours in 2-degree water, towards the crack in the hillside. Kai Kankinen, at that moment, was still underwater. All told, he spent around 11.5 hours under. On the way back, his scooter failed. The last stretch, planned at 15 minutes, took 45. He swam it under his own power, pushing his equipment ahead of him. He cut his stops short as well. There was not enough oxygen for the full protocol. The hole cut that morning with a chainsaw had frozen over again by night, under about a centimeter of ice. Kankinen broke through it, pushed his gear up onto the ice, and climbed out himself. Grönqvist and Rantanen, meeting up in the dry cave, still did not know what had happened to the others. Kankinen at that moment was getting himself out alone. The full picture only came together on the surface. Of the 5, 3 came out. They were taken to hospital that same night. Every one of them had signs of decompression sickness. Grönqvist and Kankinen got off lighter. The worst of it fell on Vesa Rantanen, the one who had been held up longest in the restriction at maximum depth. He developed a spinal cord injury, loss of sensation, trouble walking, disrupted reflexes. He was treated in a Norwegian hyperbaric chamber. Source's name, either Bergen or Tromsø. The method is the same either way. You put the patient back under pressure so the gas bubbles in the tissue dissolve, then bring him out slowly and by protocol. In all, Rantanen went through around 20 sessions in a month. The first signs that sensation and movement were coming back appeared after the third. The news went around the world's wires within a day. 2 Finnish divers had died in a Norwegian cave. The investigation took its course. The Norwegian police interviewed the survivors and gathered statements. The conclusions repeated what was already known. A tangled line for the first man, panic for the second. The wording is cautious, and that is not an accident. The picture was put back together from the accounts of 3 exhausted men, from instrument data, and from what could be seen at the site. Then the authorities made their call. Diving in the system was banned, and access to the cave was closed. Both men stayed where it had happened, far from either exit. For their families, that meant funerals with nobody to say goodbye to. The Norwegian side did what is done in hopeless cases. They called the British. 3 men came to Plurdalen: Rick Stanton, John Valanthan, and Jason Mallinson. In the cave diving world, these are the first names on the list. 4 years later, the whole world would learn them after the rescue in a flooded cave in Thailand. They did not go in from the river. The British climbed up to Steinugelflaget, went down through the dry cave, and entered the flooded section from that side to see the place with their own eyes. Freeing the first man quickly was not possible. His equipment was tangled in the lines, and there was no reaching the second one while the passage stayed blocked. One dive was never going to be enough here. Stanton laid out the prospect plainly. This was a long job, a lot of deep, cold dives, and it went far beyond what they had been asked to come and do. The official operation was called off. The Norwegian authorities judged a recovery too dangerous. Stanton also said something that was quoted a great deal afterwards. Those 2 should never have died at all. By the book, it was flawless. Nobody has the right to ask rescuers to risk their lives on a recovery. That is how the protocols are written all over the world, and they are hard to argue with. The survivors heard about it while they were still in hospital. Rantanen, at that point, was learning to walk again. For the Finns, there was only one conclusion. Nobody else was going to come back for their friends. The idea of returning was born right there, not as an impulse, as a problem that had to have a solution. A month and a half after the accident, people began drifting back into the valley. Sami Pakarinen took charge of the organizing, the 3rd man on that through dive back in September 2013. The team's argument was simple. They knew this system better than anyone from outside ever could. There was a second motive, and they said it out loud. As long as the 2 men were in the cave, it stayed shut to everybody, and for a long time. The recovery was also a way of giving Plura back to the cave diving community. Nobody granted permission, and nobody asked for it. The ban was in force. On the 22nd of March, 2014, the team gathered in Plurdalen, quietly, by truck, by car, on sledges and snowmobiles. Estimates of the numbers vary. Different sources give 17, 24, and 27 people, Finns and Norwegians together. This time, they prepared differently than they had in February. The plan was built around every equipment failure they could imagine. The first job was hauling more than a ton of gear up to the dry cave at Stein-Ugelflaget. It went up in pieces on a winch and cable, straight up the slope. Around 50 gas cylinders were staged along the route, with a margin for scenarios everyone hoped would never be needed. On the Plura side, about a kilometer in from the entrance, they set up an underwater habitat. It is a chamber with air trapped under the roof, where you can put your head up during decompression, take the mouthpiece out, talk, warm up. On stops that run for hours, that is worth a great deal. 3 men took on the main work at depth: Pakarinen, Grönqvist, and Kankinen. Vesa Rantanen, still not recovered from his spinal cord injury, ran the operation from the surface. Every working dive was filmed on helmet cameras, deliberately and decided in advance. That was the insurance. Every step underwater had to be backed up, both for the investigation and for the families. The plan was broken into stages. First, free the first man from the lines in that same restriction at a depth of around 120 meters. Then move both of them through the deep part of the system to Stein-Ugelflaget, all of it in series of dives, with hours of decompression after every one. The operation took 5 days. Both men were brought through to Stein-Ugelflaget and handed over to the Norwegian services, one first, the second, the following day. From there, the rescue services carried them out, up the same route the survivors had climbed in February. Pakarinen phoned the authorities himself the morning after. All the camera footage and the recovered equipment were handed over to the police. On the 26th of March, a memorial service was held at the entrance to Stein-Ugelflaget. Then came the time to answer for it. The Norwegian side was obliged to look into what had happened. Sources disagree on whether any of the participants were detained. The proceedings took around 6 months. In the end, no charges were brought. Patrick Grönqvist was awarded the Medal of the Order of the White Rose of Finland. At the end of April, about 2.5 weeks after the funerals, the 3 survivors left on a 2-week cave diving trip to Spain and France. Not one of them gave up caves. In 2016, the documentary Diving into the Unknown came out, directed by Juan Reyna, the very project that had started life as a story about a record attempt. The cave was later reopened to diving. In April 2024, an American diver, Jared Hires, died in the system. And 2 years after that, Pakarinen and Grönqvist were bringing divers home again, in another country at somebody else's request. 12 years on, they were doing what they had learned under a Norwegian mountain.